There's been some interesting times in the last couple of months, particularly over in Syria. And there's been a report that's come out in the last couple of days. Russian pilots have attempted to dogfight US jets over Syria. How's that going for you? I bet you they would last about 20 seconds in the scheme of things, making several recent incidents of aggressive behavior. While not going so far as attempting to shoot down American jets, because they can't, they may be trying to provoke the US into an international incident. According to Colonel Joe Buccino of US Central Command, the hostile behavior began in March and has raised concerns among US military officials about potential miscalculations and escalation. Previous incidents include Russian jets violating coalition airspace and coming dangerously close to US aircraft. American pilots have been advised not to engage with the Russians, and US officials have reached out to their Russian counterparts regarding these incidents, but they haven't received satisfactory responses. Get this, since March, Russian jets have violated deconfliction protocols over 85 times. And it's some serious stuff that's going on there, but I think it's a little bit funny. And part of the reason that I raised it is because the Russian Air Force has been found wanting in Ukraine. They just haven't performed the way that we thought that they would. They've got large numbers of aircraft. They seem to have really good equipment, but the reality is on the battlefield, they've failed to maintain or even gain air superiority against otherwise some sort of strange adversary, which is a Frankenstein of a bunch of different things. They just haven't been able to gain the upper hand. And in order to actually win a conflict and actually take the ground, you need to own the air. And that's the reason that the coalition and us here in the West are so successful on the battlefield in the modern battle space, is because we can own the air pretty quickly. And once you own the air, you're able to move up because you're able to cover the troops on the ground and be able to do that. So far, the Russian Air Force hasn't been able to do that. And their experience extends only to Syria, which is an unopposed location. And we saw the accident, which is what I call it. It wasn't even an incident, where the Russian fighter jet crashed into the American Reaper drone a couple of weeks ago. And when you look at the footage of all of that, it doesn't actually look deliberate to me. I think they were deliberately flying around it, trying to cause all sorts of problems. But when the pilot actually collected the drone, what you see is it looks like he's just closing up on the thing too quickly. And I've done not a lot of formation flying. I've done a fair bit of formation flying. And the number one rule when you're formation flying is, what do you think it might be, Ed?
Don't hit the guy next to you. I don't know.
Yeah, and how do you reckon you don't do that?
You keep an eye on your wingtip. I don't know.
That's it.
Okay.
You're looking out the window, right?
Okay, right.
It's no more complicated than that, man. Flying airplanes is actually pretty easy. And when you look at the way that the Russian Su-27 collected that drone, the bottom of the jet actually crashed into it. So he completely lost sight of the drone, which says to me he was closing up on the actual drone itself, but lost control, lost sight of what was actually happening. And when I looked at that, I thought, that actually looked like the jet got away from him and the aircraft got ahead of him. And when I sort of looked at all that, I started reading, and I was just doing some analysis of all of that and thinking, what is the mainstream media? What's the deep state trying to tell me here? What narrative are they drawing me into? And I just kind of ignored all of that while I was looking. And then I came across an article that was saying that Russian fighter pilots only get about 40 to 50 hours worth of flight training a year. American and coalition fighter pilots get anywhere from 40 to 50 hours per month. So flying is and I just know from being an aviator myself, flying is a skill that decays. And it's not so much the hands and feet skills. Like, it's pretty easy to take off and land an airplane and to operate the controls and to navigate and to do all of those things. But what is really quite difficult to do is to stay ahead of the airplane in your brain. So, and especially the bigger airplanes get, the more complicated they get, the further ahead of the aircraft you must be. And there's a saying in aviation that, the airplane will crash and you'll walk up behind it 10 minutes later, scratching your head going, what happened? Because it got so far ahead of you and the aircraft got so far in front of you that you just couldn't catch up mentally to what it was supposed to be doing. And that's part of the reason that airliners don't just have one pilot, right? You need several people inside of a flight deck to actually be able to manage those things. Even with all of that automation, you still need people there to actually manage it. And so when you look at single seat fighter operations like the Russians and Americans in Syria, those Russians, I promise you, man, they will last about 20 seconds in a knife fight in a phone booth with American fighter pilots. And I was just scrolling through my YouTube randomly yesterday, creating some videos, and I was watching this F-16 demo pilot from just a couple of days ago in some air show somewhere in the States. And I was just watching the way they took off and the different camera angles, and it was like a montage of all of these air show clips that were put together. And these fighter pilots, there's a woman of all things, not that that should make any difference, but it just kind of shows you, are they female Russian fighter pilots in the American Air Force at the standard of a demo pilot that could pull off those things like that woman did at an American air show? And the answer is no. Most men couldn't do that. And this is not a gender thing that I'm saying, but what I'm saying is the quality of training that we have with our Air Force just shows and proves that the Russian Air Force have absolutely no idea what they're doing. And if they're in Syria provoking American fighter jets, just be careful, man, because if you fly too close to the sun, you're going to get burnt, right? And I find it just alarming that there's 85 incidents. So think about how many patrols will go on per day and what's happening there. There's probably, half a dozen patrols that happen on a daily basis. So this is going on a couple of times a day where the Russians are intercepting American jets and they're closing up on them and causing all sorts of problems. And it must be the hardest thing in the world for these American fighter pilots to restrain themselves and not give these guys a bloody nose and teach them a lesson.
Well, that's just it, right? And I mean, you always have the bully in the neighborhood who can reign and get away and create all sorts of chaos and create fear. But until the next big guy comes along in the neighborhood and shows them who's who. And the Russian pilots right now, they're more advanced, I'm sure, than the Ukrainian pilots. So they are the big dogs at the moment. But yeah, like you said, our guys are probably just itching to get in there and show them what's what. But that's that's a whole new ball game, though. Zelensky's been asking for these advanced fighter jets and advanced weapon systems since the beginning. You and I talked before. All right, so what if we did give him the latest batch of fighter jets? Who's going to fly the things? It takes a long time to get trained on the what's the latest one? The F-16. What's the newest one? F-35?
Yeah, well, that's what they're asking for. F-16s because they're pretty prolific and they're available to be supported.
But how complicated is the F-35?
Less complicated than the F-16. The fifth gen aircraft is completely different to fourth gen, but that's the thing. They're never going to get an F-35. And if this escalates into a conflict where NATO actually become part of it, NATO will just destroy the Russians in the first couple of hours of the war. And not a lot of people realize that. That is the reality. That's the unspoken truth that no one speaks about. Yeah. And that's because no news anchor on CNN is willing to come out and make that prediction or to say those things. A couple of squadrons of F-35s and F-22s will go in there and completely destroy the Russian Air Force in the first few hours of the war. Right. And then you send the close air support aircraft in shortly after. They'll just completely and totally decimate the Russians. This thing could be over literally in a matter of like a week.
Well,
it's really strange because
I mean, the current status of the war could be over, but we talk about all the unintended consequences. Well, because that's going to be a huge escalation, right? If we were to send, if NATO were to send in our jets and demolish the Russian Air Force, okay, now we're in a whole different ballgame. Now we got, certain people dusting off some nuclear, buttons, and that's the last thing you want. So you got to think through, you got to look beyond the next step, right? When you go into warfare, I assume you have to look, well, if we do this, this is what could happen from that. I assume there has to be some gaming on that, right? There's got to be some war gaming.
Well, there's precedent.